Archives are about space and about time. There is always a hidden something that we have to look for very carefully.
A hidden concept, a hidden document, and a hidden narrative. How can we preserve an archive?
And how can we preserve documents in an archive? Archives are very important as a protest against forgetting.
If we want to anticipate the future, the lessons of history as a discipline are central to the art of archiving.
The future is sometimes invented with fragments from the past.
I'm very happy we can do this interview for our friends Elena and Norman Foster and for their amazing, extraordinary foundation in Madrid. Have you been to Madrid to see it?
No, I have not. I've been in Madrid many years before it was created, but they've come to Montreal, so I saw them there.
Yeah. No, but whenever you're in Europe, it's really worthwhile a trip to Madrid because it's magical and it's also very fascinating, the archive of Norman with all the drawings and the models and the notebooks. It's really beautiful.
I'm sure it's fascinating, but you know, I find when I think about archives is it's much more interesting to have not to have one person's archive somewhere, but to have a series of archives together in a collection the way we do. Because what's so interesting is to be able to compare and to see what's happening at the same time. I mean, it's so rich that way.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, I became familiar with your amazing work on archive because I was good friends with Cedric Price. And Cedric always talked about you and how his archive would go to your institution. But I wanted to ask you about the beginnings because you're an architect, also a scholar, a curator, a conservationist, an activist, a critic of architecture and urbanism, the founding director of the Canadian Centre of Architecture. It's almost like in superstring theory in quantum physics. There are so many dimensions, Phyllis, to what you do and did. And so I wanted to ask you how it all began, if there was an epiphany, how you came to architecture initially.
Oh, and coming to architecture initially is that as a child, I was a sculptor. From the time I have a piece of sculpture that says Phyllis, 10 years old or 11 years old, I think. And so, so there's a kind of real connection there in terms of observation, sense of form, etc. And I was always, art always interested me tremendously. And then I went to university and stuff like that. And I took courses, of course, in art history and practical courses. But how it started, and then when I did the Seagram building, you know that story.
Yeah, but it would be great that you could tell us just for the interview, for the record of the interview. Yeah?
Okay. Well, the Seagram building was, I guess I was living in France, and my father, who was head of the Seagram company in Montreal and had an office at in the Chrysler building in New York, and could no longer expand in the Chrysler building, and they were expanding a lot at that point, just post-war, and so he wanted to build a building in New York, and even had an idea of building buildings other places. But anyway, that was the one that was done, and so I had talked to him about it vaguely, and he came to Europe once. And I met him in Rome, and I was showing him, talking about architecture, talking about the Farnese Palace, etc., etc. And then he sent me an image of a building, and it was shocking. It was totally shocking. It was done, but it wasn't really an image that for a building, but it would have, it was for an event. It was for the 75th anniversary, I think, of Seagram, but it would have ended up being the building, okay, if I had not intervened. And it was shocking because it was so slick and had no qualities. Charles Luckman was the guy who did this, and he up to then he was trained as an architect, but he was the head of the Lever House, so he was responsible for getting Skidmore Bunshaft to do that building. But the building that he then proposed for Seagram, which was just catty corner across from that, had nothing to do with contemporary architecture at all. I mean, it was just a slick advertising affair. And so I was horrified. And, you know, after a certain amount of time, I went to see Pevsner and sort of study stuff at the Reba, you know, contemporary, well, the post, well, the 20s and 30s and stuff like that, and looked at buildings in Europe. And so I came back to New York and I talked to the Museum of Modern Art, and my father had engaged a company, well, he engaged the man who headed the biggest construction company, the Fuller Company. And so he, you know, after I said to him, I'd seen also, oh, what was his name? Oh, goodness, he wrote the Brown Decades. He wrote articles in the New Yorker all the time. Great famous name, but I just can't think of it right now. But anyway, he was a very fair person I met.
Mumford, you mean Mumford Lewis?
Yes, I do mean Mumford, Lewis Mumford, yep. And
so you knew Mumford?
Pardon?
You knew Mumford Lewis?
No, I didn't. A friend of mine knew him.
Yeah.
And made an appointment with me to see him. It wasn't so difficult. But and I didn't know I didn't know Alfred Barr either, but I knew the person who was his assistant, who I'd gone to university with. So, you know, all these things come together. Anyway, and then so he told my father that I should, you know, I was, by the time I saw him, I had, you know, I was a very quick learner at that point. It was just so fascinating to me and so important. And so I was able to convince him that, it was, you know, that anyway, I didn't convince him I should do it, but he was convinced that I should do the research. Yeah. And so, because he had suggested a clerk of the works. And so my father thought that that would be the person to find the architect, not knowing anything, of course. So anyway, I said I needed 2 weeks, I think. No, 6 weeks, I'm sorry. Did I say 6 weeks? I think 2 weeks wouldn't be enough. Anyway, so I went around to visit people in their offices, architects, and the list was made. Of course, I met Philip Johnson because Alfred Barr said, go and visit Johnson. But remember, he's going to now leave the museum and he's going to open his own, he's opening his own office. Anyway, so I met, at his place, I met Eero Saarinen, who was a great list maker. And that was a very interesting time because he made a list of those who could and shouldn't, those who could and shouldn't. Well, let's start off with those who should and couldn't. No, could and shouldn't. That's all the horrible big firms, you know, and we even put Skidmore, Erings and Merrill in there because they, you know, they just done this Lever House and it was, you know, a very sort of, well, it wasn't an essential, it was a secondhand affair. And then those who could, anyway, those who could and shouldn't, well, anyway, the younger people, yeah. Who were, you know, I.M. Pei was part of it. So was a person who did the towers afterwards. Anyway, so I went to all their offices. Of course, those who could and should were Mies and Frank Lloyd Wright.
That's amazing. So basically Saarinen, because he was always very clear about this good architecture. He basically said that drawn language is a revealing language. One can see in a few lines whether a person is really an architect. So he made lists for you. He made lists. That's amazing. I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was a big list maker. It was sort of fun. I mean, he and Philip were sort of batting it back and forth. Who should go on what part of the list? And as I said, so I went to see them, and also the head of the head of the construction firm asked me to see some of the big firms, and so I went to see them, which was very interesting because they were so horrible. You know, you go to an office, you see the environment, you get a sense of what people are thinking and how they approach things, and of course you see what they have on the drawing boards. So anyway, I went to see Mies really just about at the end of the journey, but it was so clear to me well, first of all, everybody talked in terms of peace. They like Arrow himself. I saw him later, but he said I wouldn't, I would do this, but not like Mies. And everybody had something they were going to do, but not like Mies. And so I thought, well, I didn't see anybody who was going to do something better than Mies. And I didn't think Le Corbusier was right, because I didn't think that, I couldn't see his kind of work on Park Avenue, which is where the place was, and for an office building. Although he had done some buildings in South America, of course, for offices. Anyway, and Frank Lloyd Wright, was, I think that so did Philip and Arrow, somebody of another period, another era, the era of when, Manifest Destiny of the United States. So anyway, that was, although he had proposed, he heard about it through my uncle, and he had proposed a mile-high tower.
Wow.
So that was a kind of thing that happened. So I came back and spoke to Crandall, who was the head of the company, and so he thought that it was perfectly doable with Mies. And then he said, who should be the associate architect? Because Mies is 70. I'm 90 now. Mies is 70. So what will he, what happens if he doesn't able to carry it out? And so I really didn't know. And he suggested Philip, which I thought was probably a very good idea, because Mies was not a New Yorker. I was not a New Yorker.
So it would be great to hear a little bit about this passion of collecting architectural drawings, how it began, and what were the sort of first drawings you collected?
Well, I think maybe the first drawing, well, it was a time there, I guess, auctions were just beginning. And a friend of my mother's, who I became friendly with, was an art historian. She was mostly interested in Boucher, but she's a scholar of Boucher. But she also created with her husband a rare drawings business. And so she was the one who went to watch all of the auctions. And it was mostly decorative drawings that she got for various people. And at that time, most of the drawings for architecture were decorative too. But I think the first drawing I got was supposedly, oh goodness, what's his name? Drawing for the Cortile of the Belvedere in Rome. So you have this absolutely wonderful drawing showing the Cortile with the popes going on over the wall, on the edge of the wall. And I was taking courses at the Institute of Fine Arts with Krautheimer and with Lehmann. And I saw Krautheimer had talked about this in one of his courses. So of course I was hugely excited to find that. That's what I remember the most. It was just a great drawing. And I was interested. I wanted to get working drawings because I thought that I was working with Mies. I wanted to know really how architects worked at different times and different places. So we formed a collection I was able to form a collection that was really interesting from, beyond earlier than Palladio, some of the early Venetian drawings. And the 18th century, of course, is a very rich time. So there are drawings from, of course, Italy and France and England, but also from Germany. And so that's how I started. And then I had this collection. I took this collection with me to New Haven when I went to Yale. I went to Yale first, and then I took it with me to Chicago to IIT, where I did my master's there. And then after that, and I had it in a course in New York also. And then I returned to Montreal in 1977, I guess 71, when I was doing the Sadie. No, I did 67. 60, yeah. I finished the Sadie Bronfman Center at 67. I did it from 63 to 67. And so when I was there, I saw all these wonderful buildings. The Greystone buildings that as a child I thought were wonderful. And so I thought that when I was in Chicago, you know, at the IIT, and seeing all the demolition of the, you know, this period that was the urban renewal, supposedly urban renewal, and it was really just destroying the older parts of cities, and of course the poor parts of cities, of course, which meant the black parts of cities. And so but we didn't have that kind of problem in Montreal, but they started about the 70s, starting to, or late 60s, to destroy buildings in Montreal. And I just didn't want that to happen. So I came back, and so I had two problems. Is I had this drawing collection, what to do with it, how to look after it. And I had this question of advocacy, of how to stop the demolition, and how to build good cities. And so I thought, well, people don't understand a thing about architecture. It's not just the moment that one has to deal with. They never understand about architecture. So I thought, well, then maybe I need an institution.
So you realized that you wanted, I mean, that's the moment when there was sort of the birth of the idea of your own institution and an archive. And it's of course very fascinating because there are many museums for contemporary art, but there are not many museums for architecture. I mean, for example, you know, I live in the UK, and it's quite extraordinary that in a country like the UK, which has produced generations now of extraordinary architects like Norman and Norman Foster and Richard Rogers, are also, of course, Cedric Price, who is in your archive, but whose archive you have, are also Zaha Hadid. It's extraordinary that a country like the UK, who have many art museums, many craft and, you know, institutions for many different purposes, doesn't have an architecture museum. And I remember many years ago, I read an article in Italy, which was a polemic, you know, why wouldn't Italy have an architecture museum? So in a way, and obviously you didn't do a museum, you did do a center, but there is clearly a missing institution for architecture in many places in the world. So something was missing, no?
Well, it was very interesting because when I was in the process of putting together all the documents and stuff like that, and collecting, you know, still collecting, and setting up an office to start cataloging material. At that point, there was because John Harris, of course, had formed the architectural collection at RIBA, and that could have been a museum, but somehow things don't work that way. Okay, it didn't work that way, and John was quite brilliant. At the same time, he told me that there's this organization that was forming is in Finland, and it was a meeting to see if we could form an architectural association of architectural museums, which we did. And it was called the ICAM, International Confederation of Architectural Museums. And I was at the very first meeting with him, and he became the president of it, and I think I was the next president afterwards. And we had it was really fascinating because there were people who were concerned, for example, in Paris, of course, there are great archives everywhere, but you know, archives is not a place, they're static, and we'll talk about that later. Yeah. Those kind of archives were static. And so they waited for somebody to come and look at the material, that was all. But they didn't activate the material. So, yeah. And so John, and so we formed this, and the interesting thing was that the northern countries that have much less architecture were the ones that wanted to have architectural museums. So that was Finland, Sweden, and also at the first meeting, people from Russia were there, and there's somebody came from Canada also, and somebody came from the United States. So yeah. there was a moment because Well, you know, in Belgium, the actually, what was it called? Anyway, the archives were formed by a man whose name I can't think of right now, and he came to Paris and formed the museum there. But it was there was nothing that was cataloged. Nobody knew what anybody had,
Yeah.
and so it was amazing. And then we also started to look at what happens with digitizing. But this is in the what 70s, so early 80s. So you know it was very primitive at that time, and it was quite fascinating. There we were working on all these levels, and it was really very interesting. And but there are museums now, and I think in various countries. And there's an organization still exists very much, and it was an exchange of information, exchange of how do you set up a place, you know, all those things that you can help each other with.
Yeah. And you decided, thank you, that's really a wonderful explanation. You decided, what is interesting, to not do a museum, but to do a center. And you wanted it to be contemporary. You wanted it to be contemporary in the sense of it, as you once said, and I remember when we met in Berlin at this conference many years ago, about 10, 15 years ago, you talked about this idea of a center which is contemporary and pushes the boundary.
Exactly.
I'm very interested in that because obviously an archive is often about the past, but Panofsky, and this is a free quote, he sort of interpreting Panofsky, there is this idea that the future can be invented with fragments from the past. So what you build in a way is not a mausoleum for archives, but you build a tool how something truly contemporary, which pushes the boundary, can be built by archive. And I'm very interested in that and wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about that and how you then also commissioned Peter Rose to do the CCA and how it became this amazing institution it is today.
Well, the question was that I wanted to do, as I said, I wasn't interested in you know, the study of the drawing as such and connoisseurship, but I really wanted to know the context, okay, in every way. And to me, it was the CCA was formed in 97 as a as an institution that was for which architecture is a public concern. That was our major thing. Now you can interpret that many ways. And as far as I was concerned, that buildings from the past, and we had a considerable architect, a couple of thousand drawings from, oh, I'd say even more than that, from the before the 20th century, and so those buildings of the past, and you know, we've also had archives in that were complete drawings for buildings in London, for example, and so on, and in France also. So that but one of the problems became, you know, one of the issues really became with ICAM was not poaching in other people's properties. You know, the question of, remember when there was one of the major architects in France, archives came up for sale, and I remember getting on the phone to everybody saying, look, don't touch it, leave it to France, because I was, you know, why should one have that here? I mean, we have the older stuff, okay, but I think the whole attitude towards archives developed and over this time, and we developed it even further at the CCA. You know, our collection is very varied. We have, I have some statistics here for you. Yeah. I asked the CCA for them. We have 250,000 monographs, 6,000 periodicals, 400 running subscriptions, 65,000 works in the photo collection, 50,000 in the prints and drawings collection, and 219 archives, including some 5,000 models. So it's quite an extensive material. Also, we have ephemera, of course. so that the material from the past it becomes more and more. We don't do exhibitions sort of saying, okay, on, let's say, Palladio or something like that, but we have had, of course, but we work with, our collection is international, and we work very closely with various museums in various places. For example, the Palladio Museum in Vicenza and other places, but in Portugal with the archive of Caesar. So anyway, the collection was sort of formed. First of all, the very first collection I acquired was that of the archive was of the major architect of the first half of the 20th century in Montreal, who Ernest Cormier, and it's an extraordinary carve out, and it's the only you never really find much in the way of archives like that, because it has not only all his drawings, most of them done by him actually, and of course blueprints and stuff, but also you have his library. We have his library, and the records of the office saying who did what and what was happening, and also sculpture and photography and watercolors, all of which he did. I think that the CCA is starting to take that over now, which is a good thing. But I worked. I couldn't just. I had to have a place where people could talk about architecture, think about architecture, a place that says it's an architecture center, so people are aware of such a thing, and that was, I think, terribly important. But at the same time, I couldn't do that without intervening in the problems that existed. The stopping demolition, working on forming, whole areas of we were able to do this, a whole area that was turned into a not-for-profit cooperative in the middle of the town. I mean, these were wonderful things. And I still do that in terms of trying to get, as you know, housing is a huge problem everywhere. And we've been doing that for years. And where we've brought in people from the business world, businesses and some corporations to actually do this. So I think it's important to do both.
Yeah, I totally agree. And of course, also, what is so interesting is that with the CCA, you developed a tool to actually disseminate architecture. So it would be great to hear a little bit more about the mission, no? Because you're on a mission, I feel.
Yes, absolutely. And the mission is to make architecture public concern. So we have, we do exhibitions, but the exhibitions are research exhibitions, especially now, in the last, I guess since Mirko was there, which is what, in 2005, I guess. Was it that far? Yeah, I think so. And so the mission is always to look at what's not being looked at, and to be very critical about what is happening. And then there are always the books that are associated